Seeger is a songwriter, a political activist, a musician, a writer, a storyteller, and a story that is told. The Pete Seeger story is a good story. His beliefs and the actions they led to is inspiring even if you don't share his beliefs, though it certainly does help. His life is a model of living by one's virtues, of being willing to suffer for that virtuousness, and winning in the end. That is a good story. Whenever Pete is spoken of, it's almost universally dedicated to his combining of political activism with traditional folk songs, or vice versa. But what is rarely noted is that he is a recording artist whose career started in the early 1940s and he is still releasing new music today. Pete Seeger himself has been often quoted to say his earlier records were like collector's items. Only the collectors bought them. Well, as it happens, I'm a bit of a collector. I won't brag to say I have a complete knowledge or the extensive catalog of everything that he's ever put out. It really is just too big. But in familiarizing myself with fondness and respect for everything Pete has done the whole of his career, I found that his recording career also tells a story. And it's a pretty good story. This is part 1 of a 4-part series exploring the discography of one of the most influential musicians and political figures of the 20th century, Pete Seeger. Pete Seeger's recording career began in the early 1940s with a group called the Almanac Singers. They were an anonymous collective of communists and activists who used songs to rally political actions. Their technique was to take old folk songs that were common among ordinary people and put new lyrics to them that reflected whatever they were protesting for or against. The band was very fluid and changing from show to show. It sometimes would be just Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, and sometimes it would be a full band with a ragtag folk choir. The main consistent factor, though, was Pete Seeger himself. The Almanac Singers recorded a few albums, but the main album and my personal bit of favorite music that Pete Seeger ever recorded is Talking Union. It was an album made up of old folk songs that had pro-union lyrics added on. Though the basis of these songs was very old, the tacked-on lyrics seemed very natural and at home, as if they were written just for these songs. Whether you agree or disagree with the leftist politics on this, it's hard not to love this music.
Casey Jones got a wooden medal for being good and faithful on the SP line.
The choruses are based on century-old melodies that are meant for large groups of people to sing along with, and on this record, everyone sings along. The songs are simple enough that it's not only easy enough to start singing along before the song is over, it's irresistible. We're gonna roll, we're gonna roll, we're gonna roll, Union on. We're gonna roll, we're gonna roll, we're gonna roll the Union on. If the boss gets in the Almanac Singers and Talking Union showcase the consistent truth for the bulk of Pete Seeger's recording career. Pete is at his best when he's playing with other people. With the beginning of his recording career, Pete Seeger showcased his strength as an organizer of a project and a lending of spirit and ideas. Musically, he himself doesn't do anything too fancy, and the best part of the albums are where he isn't even the focus. To be honest, I think that the title track, Talking Union, the most Pete Seeger song on the album, is probably the weakest song. It's something you can hear it and like it only if you agree with it, and even then, you don't need to ever hear it again. Whereas Which Side Are You On is a much more moving Union song, and it just begs for re-listening. Something about folk songs in the minor key. Though Pete Seeger was just an anonymous member of this musical collective, as his career opened up, it became clear his fingerprints were all over this record and project. His preferences, his idea, and simply his taste shines through in making an engaging and fun album 70 years after it was recorded. This is part 2 of a 4-part series exploring the recorded discography of Pete Seeger. Part 1 dealt with the beginning of his recording career in the 1940s, and this part will deal with the highlights of his released music in the 1950s. The next major step for Pete Seeger after the Almanac Singers was a group called the Weavers. They were a pop folk group, and it was an attempt by Pete and some of his previous playing partners to have mainstream success with folk music. And they're completely horrible, and since I don't like their music, I'm gonna completely skip them. Even if I think their music isn't worth talking about, it's worth noting that having achieved great commercial success, they were eventually blacklisted for being communist suspicion. I mean, actually communist probably. I mean, you know, leftists in the 1950s. That's for the best. They really epitomized the blandness of pop music at the time that eventually rock and roll would do away with. And secondly, they led to a more interesting and creative time period for Pete Seeger. After having been blacklisted, Pete Seeger wasn't allowed to be played on major media outlets. It could have been a complete career killer, but instead Pete went DIY, lo-fi, and underground. Throughout the 50s, Pete traveled the country touring small community centers, at school, for children, and leftist political actions anywhere that would have him. It's ironic that his political views were viewed so dangerous at the time he wasn't allowed on the radio, but he was welcome to play in colleges, and he probably played for more children than he did for adults in the 1950s. During this time period, his albums were very simple affairs. They were mostly released by the small but hugely important independent record label, Folkways Records. These records sounded like Pete Seeger simply walked into a quiet room, sat down and played the banjo and sang, and then walked out. No frills. They probably took as long to record as they did for him to play the songs. The feel of these records is as if you invited a friend over to your house and he's playing songs in the kitchen to make your children laugh. This is probably my favorite era for Pete Seeger's recording career. These lo-fi records sound extraordinarily real in their plainness. Though during this time period he was learning how to work a crowd and get a mass of people to sing along with him during his live shows, for which he was very well known eventually, these early Folkways recordings sound completely unprofessional and uncommercial. The idea that folk music is something normal people sing and play is expressed perfectly in Birds, Beasts, Bugs, and Bigger Fishes, or in Love Songs for Friends and Foes. On all of these records, he sounds completely common. He's drenching himself in the forgotten music of America and from songs from all around the world, and then he's presenting them to anyone who will listen to them as if they all owned this as their heritage and history. These songs are presented like someone you never heard of died and you inherited an acre of their land, and he says to them, "This is your land," pun intended. "It doesn't look like much, but it's yours and you can do whatever you want with it. Let's do something great." These albums are not essential listening, for sure. I mean, I described them earlier as uncommercial, and it's not like that adjective suggests must hear. Some of them are very topical for the times, and they make sense in a context, but it's not too grabbing now. And some of them just sound like children's music, which they were. But these records describe a part of the important message that Pete Seeger's music had to give, which is this: music is not just a commodity. It's not something to be bought and sold, but a part of how we people communicate and relate and live our lives. The most important song of your life need not be the one you heard on the radio or one that you bought, but it could be something that you made up with your friends, or tunes that your parents sang to when you were a child. They could be older than the oldest building you've ever seen, or as new as the thought that's in your head at this very moment. Music is not just this perfected product wrapped in plastic and sold in stores. You already have music. Music is a part of your life. In between the notes and the words and the music on these records, that message there is as plain as day, which was wrapped in plastic and sold in stores by Folkways Records. What can you do, eh? But now these old records litter the dollar bins of record stores all around the world. Get them while you can.
We shall overcome.
Hello, this is part 3 of a 4-part series exploring the recorded discography of Pete Seeger. This episode will deal with his successful career in the 1960s on Columbia Records. Pete Seeger liked to relate himself to Johnny Appleseed, but instead of wandering the country planting trees, he was planting songs. Though Pete can't get all the credit or the blame, he was instrumental for the folk revival of the 1960s. With the rise of interest in traditional American folk music and the popularity of professional folk acts like the Kingston Trio or Peter, Paul and Mary, Pete had a rise in popularity himself. Songs that he had written or co-written or was a factor in making well known became hit songs in the top 40. If I Had a Hammer, Turn, 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 Where Have All the Flowers Gone were all songs that he wrote. The Lion Sleeps Tonight, that's based on the South African pop song that Pete Seeger recorded a version of with the Weavers, and We Shall Overcome, Pete was instrumental in making that an anthem for the civil rights movement. He recorded a version of Miserlou before Dick Dale did. Certainly that interest in traditional folk music is something that Pete Seeger was hands-on involved in. I can't really say that Pete Seeger was actually influential though. It's not like there's any Pete Seeger ripoffs out there. Woody Guthrie has a lot more army of clones. But Pete Seeger certainly had his finger on the pulse of what was happening all around the country musically. Pete Seeger's star rose during this time period and he had fame on his own terms. To be honest, Pete Seeger's really is kind of niche listening, but Columbia Records did a great job of finding the most accessible, the most interesting, and the most enjoyable side of Pete Seeger and his music. Easily the best record from this era, if not the best record that Pete has ever made, was unsurprisingly a live album. Though Pete was very successful at songwriting during this time period, his real fame was in his live shows, where he managed to get all the crowd to sing along. He was even sort of teased for this by Phil Oakes in the satirical song, Love Me, I'm a Liberal. But the album, We Shall Overcome, Pete Seeger Live at Carnegie Hall, showcases what a few hundred people who were all on the same page, singing songs with conviction sounds like. It was recorded in 1963 and Pete was heavily involved with the civil rights movement in the South. Let me just say that the civil rights movement did not start in the 60s, not even in the 50s. That's just when white people got involved. The African American people had been fighting, working, and organizing for their freedom all along. The good Reverend Martin Luther King was just a part of the larger movement. He was the crashing of the wave, not the ocean itself. But let's get back to Pete Seeger. This record sounds what the civil rights movement sounded like in that regard. It's white people telling other white people what the black people are doing in the South. At this point, segregation was no secret. White folks in the North knew what white folks in the South were doing. If not, how could have Strange Fruit been a hit? What they didn't know was what the black folks were doing. This record sounds like 100 people saying, no 100 people singing, they're right, they should be free, they're right, they're right, they're right. Even though civil rights is the main point of this record, it really is an excellent snapshot of the early 60s in America. He sings songs by the still very new Bob Dylan. He has an excellent poem set to music about Marilyn Monroe, and there's a folk song from Cuba. It's very much a postcard of the times. The album is actually beautiful, it's powerful, it's actually very fun, there's a lot of laughs in it, and it seems like the people singing know that they have the moral high ground. This album is not only essential Pete Seeger listening, but I think it's an essential listening for the image of the 60s at the time. That era of music and culture now gets completely painted by the hippies, drugs, psychedelic rock, people dancing in the park. But this album shows another side of the picture of the 60s and the hippies and the political activism that was deeply rooted in the past, what was happening in the present, and looking forward to the future. This is a great record. The best album that Pete Seeger ever made would be his last in the 1960s for Columbia Records, Waist Deep in the Big Muddy and Other Love Songs. This album is mostly known because the title track was famously censored on television. But let me just say, first off, Waist Deep is much more of an anti-authoritarian song than an anti-war song, though obviously there is a connection. Secondly, the song's not that good. Like Talking Union, it's only enjoyable if you agree with the message, but it's not that catchy, it's not fun, you can't sing along with it, it's not subtle, and it's not that smart. This song is a joyless think piece that you can agree with and still forget about 2 minutes after you heard it. I'm not saying that it's wrong, but if the lead song from this album that he had been pushing for was as beautiful, power, and flawless as Where Have All the Flowers Gone, the censor board would have had a real hard time stopping it from being a hit. That said, this is still an excellent album. This was before CDs, duh, and the two sides of the records had two separate flavors and feel. The first side of this record really seems to acknowledge that Pete's at his best when other people play and sing along with him. He has a rather nondescript rock-like group backing him up, but the real highlight is the gospel-like choir singing backup. Pete Seeger is very, very white, very Caucasian. For better or worse, he is this ultra-wasp, and this comes through in his music. It's not very emotional sounding, it's very planned and intentional, which has its own value. But by adding a bit of soul and feeling to the general flavor of this album, it helps express the more wide perspective of what Pete Seeger was planning and intending with this music. He does the cliche white guy thing where he starts singing on the first beat and the choir starts singing on the second beat. But instead of making it seem like he's out of touch, it's like the two musical traditions are acknowledging each other, playing off of each other, and combining their preferences for a more powerful and musical expression. The second side of the record is much more traditional Pete Seeger sounding and has very much the same setup as his Folkways recordings, but with all the amenities of modern recording to help it out. One man and his instrument, sure, just like the early records, but this time around there's some natural sounding reverb, probably a good amount of EQing, and the hard task of making the banjo, an admittedly harsh or even obnoxious sounding instrument, sound good. There's a variety of folk songs from a variety of traditions, and a few political originals that have a quality that Pete Seeger is not really known for: subtlety. Of all of his Columbia records, this one I find the most worthy of note because unlike the bulk of his recording career, this one will probably be just as suitable for background listening. This is an album you can listen to paying attention to the words with great seriousness, or it's something you can put on while you're getting ready for your day or while doing the dishes. It's funny to use that as a selling point, considering that the album came out the same year as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band and Jimi Hendrix's debut album, and really these albums had the wide influence that Pete Seeger was undoubtedly hoping for his whole career. But considering how out of touch with the mainstream or youth culture that a middle-aged bald man playing the banjo could be, the ability to make an interesting record that is enjoyable to listen to casually in itself is a great feat. And this is it. This is going to be the last section of this video. Every other part we looked at his career during different decades and eras of his career. But this is going to be odds and ends. We're going to see if we can find some shiny moments in his career that most fans wouldn't know about, as well as being an excellent introduction to new fans. My own introduction to Pete Seeger's music was through his Greatest Hits album, which I found in a dollar bin in a record store. He didn't actually have any hits himself, just little boxes which he didn't even write himself, but the album is really an exploration of his whole musical career and musical vision. What really impressed me when I first heard this album was that every single song was about something. Even a simple folk song that you imagine existing exclusively in children camp songs from the 1950s, it was revealed to have a strong history with meaning that applied to back then, hundreds of centuries ago, and today now. On this album, Pete's playing a little banjo ditty, just a little instrumental tune, and then he interrupts it to talk about how it sounds just like a clear, clean little creek. Sure, the big rivers and lakes may be polluted, but there's still clean creeks still out there. Even on this short little banjo instrumental tune, Pete wraps up his thoughts on mainstream music, the strength of small communities, and environmentalism. With just a little bit of investigation, on every song on this album you can find great meaning and the association between the issues Pete Seeger really cared about. Next, one of the greatest surprises for me was buying this album by Oscar Brand called Pie in the Sky. I found it in a cheap used bin at the record store. I bought it because it's named after a Joe Hill song, which is right up my alley at the time. And I heard that Oscar the Grouch from Sesame Street is actually named after this Oscar Brand guy. That is cool. I put on the record and I heard guitar and banjo and thought, that banjo player sounds like the old Pete Seeger style. Then the vocals come in and it was unmistakable. It was young Pete Seeger. Though billed as an Oscar Brand album, it's really a full-on collaboration between the two. Oscar Brand and Pete Seeger really walk the same lines, so the fact that they work together is no real surprise. This album, though, feels more characteristic of pre-fame Pete Seeger more than Oscar's brand of music. Pun intended! But again, further shows that Pete Seeger is better when he's playing with someone else. These are a lot of the same songs that he always played and sung by himself, but they're much more enjoyable by adding a guitar and a second voice around. The best song easily on this album would be their spirited take on an old work song, or an anti-work song really. It's called Tracklining Chant, and it's probably the most accessible tune Pete ever made to my post-rock folk punk ears. It's an absolute winner. I found the song has been released on CD too, so it should be actually pretty easy to find. Since Pete has toured so much and playing live was such a big part of what made him unique, It's no surprise that he has a ton of live albums. Most of them are more like bootlegs, though there are quite a few official live albums like the Carnegie Hall one. A lot of these small independent labels putting out some anonymous live show Pete played on, they have some real gems on them. Though Pete played a lot of songs, and some of these records have songs that never were released officially, he did play the usual songs over and over again. It's not like he's the Grateful Dead or some jazz artist, but he was an adaptive artist for these songs, and it was interesting to hear the variations he would come up with. For a fan of the folk process, it's enjoyable to hear how a song would change and grow. And there's just buckets of them. Again, like a lot of Pete Seeger's career, dollar bin records, you can get them very easily. Pete Seeger said that if you took 10 of his fans and had them make a list of the best songs he's ever written or recorded, it's pretty likely that they would not agree on most things. His career really is just too big, and maybe I skipped over some of the most important parts. I don't think much of the Weavers, and his recording career after the 1960s is spotty at best. So Pete Seeger fans, please forgive me. I know I skipped over great parts of his career, and if you made this video, even if you're a big fan, you'd probably skip over some of it too. But one thing we could probably all agree on, that Pete Seeger really is such an interesting and unique artist from the last century, and he's so worth knowing about. Alright, my name is Jemmy Joe, and if you want to subscribe to my videos and see what I do in the future, we can subscribe up there. I mostly just talk about my life. I talk about folk music quite a bit, and I make music myself, so you can check it out. Till then, thanks for watching.